Chapter 7 New Responsibilities It was on May 8th, 1918, the day following the melancholy disappearance of Captain Jimmy Hall, that I was notified that I was to take his place, and henceforth was to command No. 1 Flight in our squadron. While very much gratified by this promotion, I could not help realizing that before the day was over some other man in my flight might be taking over the command in my place, just as I was taking it from Captain Hall. Many small ideas that might enable me to prolong my life in aviation had made indelible impressions upon my mind during the past weeks. Several of them had come to my attention through the ludicrous blunders I had been making. The more foolish I had felt over each mistake, the deeper became the lesson to me. I resolved, as soon as I became flight commander, that I should begin by schooling the pilots under my care in some of the life-saving tricks that I had learned. The dangerous frailty of the Nieuport's wings was one item to bear in mind. Another of these little precautions that might spell the difference between life and death was the habit I forced upon myself always to make 1 or 2 complete circles of the airplane before landing at the end of a patrol. The necessity for such a trifling precaution is reasonable. Diving swiftly and suddenly from 15,000 feet altitude, where the air is thin and very cold, to the ground level where the change in the pressure upon the temples is often severe, may very easily make the airman dizzy. He may misjudge his distance above the earth, and crash violently when trying only to skim the ground. A circuit or two just above the surface of the landing field will give him time to adjust his vision and accustom himself to the change in the air pressure. It takes but a minute, and may save a life. Incidentally, one can look about and see that no other planes are preparing to land in the same spot at the same time. 2 days after assuming my new command I was returning with my flight late in the afternoon from a patrol. As we circled about our field, I noticed a plane flattening out for a landing below me. I watched him for a moment and saw that he was coming in perfectly. The next instant I noticed another plane coming in to land from exactly the opposite direction. The wheels of both machines touched earth at the opposite ends of the field at approximately the same moment. I was powerless to do more than watch the climax of this stupid proceeding, though I believe I did try to shout out to each of them to look out for the other fellow. Of course, I could not make myself heard by anybody, but I couldn't help shouting, for I knew instinctively that they were in for a jolly good crash. The 2 machines sped gracefully towards each other head on, very much like a staged railroad collision at a county fair. Exactly in the middle of the field they met. The 2 wings embraced each other in an Aleman left figure of the Lancers, and around they went, spinning like a top. In the midst of the revolving dance, the synchronizing mechanism on Captain Marr's machine gun became involved, and flaming tracer bullets and incendiary bullets shot out of the merry-go-round at a rate of 650 shots per minute. From my box seat above it looked very much like a 4th of July celebration, with a gigantic pinwheel shooting out living sparks in every direction. Fortunately not a soul was hurt during the entire celebration, as seems to be the usual lucky outcome of mimic war maneuvers. Both pilots crawled out of the wreckage, shook hands, and walked over to the hangars to tell the men in shelter that the show was over. Then we made our landing. Next day Reed Chambers accompanied me on a patrol across the German lines, and we made another rather interesting discovery. 4 splendid Albatross machines were approaching us from over Thiaucourt, which was about 4 miles inside the enemy's territory. They were in good formation and were about our altitude. I wigwagged over to Reed, and he wigwagged back to me. We both understood each other. We were 2 against the enemy 4, but the 2 on our side had full confidence in each other, and both were fairly well bucked up over the recent successes of our squadron. Perhaps the opposing 4 might be lacking in this mutual confidence. At any rate, it was worth the chance of trying a bluff to see if we could not get them separated. It is half the game to know thoroughly one's partner and his capabilities in air fighting, as it is in any other accomplishment. Reed Chambers was a daredevil to all appearances, and was always an eager flyer, but I had noticed that he combined a rare caution with his recklessness, making him an excellent and reliable comrade in a fight. Subsequently Reed accumulated 7 official victories to his credit, and at the end of the war he stood next to me in the number of hours flying over the enemy lines. Turning simultaneously towards the Albatross group, we put on our motors and headed directly into them. We didn't swerve an inch from our parallel course as we shot straight at the center of the approaching quartet. Whether they thought we were 2 furious expert fighters from the United States, or 2 crazy amateurs who might ram them in mid-air, I do not know, but before we had arrived within fair shooting range, the leader banked over, turned tail, and, the rest of the formation sheepishly following him, they all 4 dived steeply down into Germany, leaving us a vacant sky over Thiaucourt. We had bluffed out a superior formation through sheer impudence. May 12th was a dud as far as aviation was concerned, but it was brightened with one of the pleasantest incidents that marked my stay in France. Colonel Mitchell telephoned over to the aerodrome to invite several of us to make a call with him at Chateau Sirour, a magnificent estate of an old French family, situated some 50 miles south of our aerodrome. Major Huffer, with several other officers from our squadron, left the mess with me immediately after lunch, and we reached the chateau within a few minutes of the arrival of Colonel Mitchell and Major Hall. The Countess gave us a most cordial greeting, then took us over a part of the estate, which consisted of a park some 10 miles square. The grounds were heavily wooded and beautifully kept. Through the woodland curved a winding stream which was spanned at intervals with quaint and ancient stone bridges. Fish ponds and shooting preserves provided the chateau with wild game the year round. Several wild boar crossed our roads a few paces in front of us during our walk. Shooting wild boar, we were told, was one of the favorite pastimes of the occupants of the chateau. The chateau itself contained many palatial rooms. A dimly lighted little chapel occupied one corner of the chateau, and this part of the building, we learned, dated back to the days of the Romans. During tea the Countess very graciously invited us to make this magnificent old castle our home if at any time American aviators became worn out with work at the front. I must confess to the good Countess some day that a scandalous number of our overtired aviators, and perhaps still greater a number of not at all tired American aviators, did subsequently avail themselves of her very generous invitation. After cordial goodbyes to our hospitable hostess, we motored back to Chaumont, where we dined with Colonel Mitchell, and then, with another long drive, we finally reached home tired but happy at 3:30 in the morning. There, staring me in the face, was an order directing me to lead my patrol over the lines in the morning at 5 o'clock sharp. An hour and a half sleep for an utterly worn-out aviator. Heaven must have heard my prayers for rain that night, for the next morning when I woke up at 11 o'clock and rushed to the window, I found the rain falling in sheets. The orderly had omitted to call me at the appointed hour, because he saw that the weather was too thick for flying. Decorations for valor and heroism were coming to several of the boys in our squadron on May 15th, and we all woke up that morning to find a beautiful day dawning. While we all of us assumed a truly American disdain for performances of this kind, we nevertheless clearly indicated by our nervousness the pride which we really felt in receiving this award. General Gerard, commander of the 6th French Army, was to arrive at our field shortly after lunch. All the forenoon I tried to avoid my gallant messmates, who were continually seeking me out to advise me to shave again, and to use plenty of powder on the cheeks where the general would kiss me. Both Lieutenant Jimmy Meissner and I were quite new to this decoration business, and we were nicely stuffed by all the other fellows who claimed to know all about it. Major David Peterson was also receiving the Croix de Guerre, but he had been through many ceremonies of this kind and was little worried by the prospect. Captain James Norman Hall, whom we considered killed in combat, and Lieutenant Charles Chapman, who had been shot down a fortnight before, were both summoned to appear for their well-earned distinctions, but neither, alas, could answer to his name. Shortly after 1 o'clock 3 companies of a crack poilu regiment marched onto our field behind a gorgeous French military band of music. Then came several more companies of infantry from the famous American 26th Division, the New England boys. They had a good snappy American band at their head. Both French and American soldiers drew up their ranks in the form of a hollow square in the center of our aerodrome. In the meantime we had run out all the Nieuport from the hangars, and they stood cheek by jowl across the field, shining brightly with their red, white, and blue markings in the sunlight. All the mechanics and enlisted men formed ranks behind the aeroplanes and stood awaiting the beginning of the ceremony. Jimmy Meissner and I stood shaking in our well-polished boots, while our cheery comrades came by for a last word of comforting advice. Then, with Major Peterson beside us, we waited for the fatal word of advance into the awful presence. Suddenly, midst a blare of both bands, the general's party appeared from behind one of the hangars where they had been in hiding all this time. I tried one minute to think of how proud my mother would be of me, and the next would attempt to stretch my face up to such a height that no ordinary general would ever be able to reach it with his lips. This was the last piece of excellent advice that a delegation of my oldest friends had crossed the aerodrome to give me. Suddenly a faraway band began playing something that sounded somewhat familiar. It turned out to be the national anthem. "Oh, say, can you see?" Everybody jerked to attention and stood at the salute until it ended. Then from far away in front of me, Colonel Mitchell, the head of our air service, began a brief speech congratulating us upon the honors which the French army was conferring upon us. And then General Gerard, a kindly-looking man with a business-like military efficiency in his features and movements, approached our little line of 3. He was carrying in his hands the Croix de Guerre and a printed list of citations from the French army. Pausing immediately in front of us, he began reading them aloud in French. The Croix de Guerre is a beautiful medal in bronze, artistically designed and executed. It hangs suspended from a ribbon of striped red and green, upon which are fastened the palms or stars for each particular citation given by the army or division. If any individual soldier is mentioned for an act of heroism in especial terms by an army order, he is presented with an additional palm for each of such citations. Some of the French airmen have received so many citations that the medal itself would hang down below the waist if the ribbon were properly lengthened to accommodate every palm awarded. I have seen René Fonck, the French ace of aces, who has been cited 29 times for his victories, wearing his Croix de Guerre in two sections so as to accommodate all the palms that must be worn upon ceremonial occasions. If the citations come from a division instead of an army, the decoration to be worn above the Croix de Guerre is a star instead of a palm. Colonel William Thaw wears 2 stars and 3 palms among his many other decorations. With a quick fastening of the much prized honor upon the breast of our tunics and a hearty hand clasp of congratulations, General Gerard left us, with a very dignified salute, which we all returned simultaneously. The discriminating commander had not made an attempt to kiss us at all. Within 5 minutes the field was cleared, and we were running up our motors for a prearranged exhibition in stunt flying, formation flying, farce combats, and acrobatics. We flung our lithe little Nieuport about the warm sky in every variety of contortion for half an hour, and at the end of which we landed and again received a handshake and a smile of thanks from this most courteous of French officials. The troops disappeared behind the dying strains of the Sambre et Meuse march. The mud-splashed automobiles bore away the last of our distinguished visitors. The mechanics reappeared in their grease-covered overalls and began trundling in the machines. Suddenly Jimmy Meissner stood by my side, grinning his most winsome grin. "Rick," said he, "I feel that hate the Hun feeling creeping over me. What do you say to going up and getting a Boche?" "Right," I called back over my shoulder. "Come along. We'll take a real ride." As luck would have it, we had hardly left the ground when we saw a Hun 2-seater, probably a Rumpler machine, very high above us. The Rumpler has the highest ceiling of any of the German 2-seaters, and frequently they sail along above us at an elevation quite impossible for the Nieuport to reach. It is maddening to attain one's maximum height, and see the enemy still sailing imperturbably along, taking his photographs and scorning even to fire an occasional burst at one. We climbed at our fastest to overtake this fellow before he could reach his safety spot. Evidently he got "wind up," for after a few minutes climbing he sheered off towards Germany and disappeared from our view. We completed our patrol of the lines without finding another enemy in the sky, and returned to our field, where we landed with the mutual vow that on the morrow we would begin seriously our palm collecting shows until we might dangle our new Croix de Guerre well below our knees. Jimmy looked contemplatively down at my long legs. "Have a heart, Rick," he said softly. "Think of the cost of the red tape." Chapter 8. A Victory and a Narrow Escape. Reed Chambers and I often used to discuss new tricks and wiles by which we might hope to circumvent the crafty Hun. Take it all in all, this whole game of war aviation is so new that any day some newcomer may happen upon a clever trick that none of us has before thought of. I suppose the Huns are sitting up nights the same as we are, trying to devise some startling innovation in the still crude science of air fighting. At any rate, Reed and I sat up late very often, and rose very early the next morning to carry into execution some little plan which had enraptured us the night before. On the morning of May 17th, 1918, my orderly routed me out at 4 o'clock sharp, in accordance with orders I had the night before waked him up to give him. I sent him into Reed's room to call him. Over our coffee 15 minutes later, Reed and I hurriedly discussed our clever little scheme for the morning run. We intended to get away from the ground before daylight, climb clear up out of sight and out of hearing long before the Huns were out of bed. By hanging around their front yard we might pick up a stray machine venturing alone across our lines for photographs. It was a wonderful plan. We wondered why nobody had ever thought of it before. Up over Toul and Commercy and Nancy we circled as we climbed. At nearly 18,000 feet we found we had enough climbing. It seemed about 18,000 degrees below zero at this great height. Still I hugged myself with much satisfaction over the thought that we surely had the upper hand of any 2-seater that might come over, and as the visibility was good we had a tremendous range of view. We waited and we waited. up and down along the prearranged sector, where we expected any reasonable enemy might want to come to get photographs on such a fine morning as this. Up and down, back and forth we went. At last I began to get rather fed up with the sport. Our plan had worked perfectly and without a single flaw, yet the stupid Boche were trying to gum up the whole show by staying home this morning. I finally grew indignant at the thought of our early rising hour, our fortunate weather conditions, our high ceiling cleverly obtained without knowledge of Archie, all these efforts and accomplishments honestly achieved only to be nullified by the refusal of the fish to bite. Major Lufbery used to remind us that it was impossible to get Boche by sitting at home in the billets with one's feet before the fire. I considered this sage advice as I turned back on my beat for the 20th time and estimated I still had an hour's petrol left in my tank. I was nearly perishing with the cold and with hunger. Bitterly I contrasted the cozy mess fire in the breakfast room with the frigid heights at which I had spent the last hour. And there were just as many Boche to be shot at there as here. I felt I had been badly treated. Where was Chambers, anyway? During my preoccupation I had forgotten to keep an eye upon him. I examined every portion of the sky, but he was not in sight. Nothing was in sight. No other fool in the world was abroad at such an unearthly hour. But still I had to admit to myself, Luff was right. It was just like going fishing. If there were no fish in the stream, that certainly would be hard luck. But still one couldn't expect to catch any with his feet before his fire. I smiled to myself as I thought of the Alabama-colored gentleman who spent the afternoon fishing in his water trough. A censorious white man walked by and watched him jerk his line out of the water half a dozen times. Finally the white man yelled, "You black rascal! Don't you know there are no fish in that mud hole?" "Yes, boss, but it's close and handy," replied the black. The old story gave me an idea. Perhaps I was selecting a poor fishing place, whose only merit was that it was close and handy. I pulled up my machine and started off for Metz. I knew the fishing must be good there. It was 25 miles back of the lines and claimed, besides the famous fortress, one of the best of the German aerodromes. I was now at 20,000 feet above earth, and as I turned east I saw the first ray of the sun that shone over France that day. The sun lay a huge red ball behind the distant mountains of the Rhine. I headed in that direction in order to cross the enemy's lines east of Pont-à-Mousson, where I knew lay concealed several sharp-eyed German batteries. At the extremely high altitude at which I crossed the lines that early morning, the sound of my motor must have been heard by the gunners below, but I'm sure none of them could have seen me, even with the most powerful telescopes. At any rate, not a shell was fired at me during my entire journey to Metz. The celebrated fortifications soon lay spread below my wings. Metz herself lies deep within a valley, the lovely valley of the Moselle River. Practically sheer bluffs 1,000 feet high rise on either bank of the river, and a sudden turn of the stream a mile below the city's walls provides almost an entire circumference of fortifications about the sheltered little city below. Beautiful as Metz appeared to me, I for once regretted that I was not mounted on a bombing machine from which I might drop a few souvenirs of my visit into the crowded camps below. Doubtless Metz contained hundreds of thousands of troops and many officers of high rank, as this secure little city was the gateway between Germany and her front line on the Meuse. My machine gun could inflict no damage from such a height. Regretfully I made a last farewell circuit over the Queen City of Lorraine and started homewards over the Frascati aerodrome, whose hangars topped the hills and peeped down into the valley of the Moselle. No airplanes from there had yet thought fit to leave the ground. But one more chance remained to me to get a Boche this morning. I knew of an aerodrome just this side of Thiaucourt, where some activity might be expected. My time was nearly gone, for my fuel must be rather far down. The thought of encountering engine trouble this 20 miles behind the lines made me accelerate my pace a bit. Germany would be a sad place for an enemy named Rickenbacker to land in for the duration of the war. I stuck my nose down a bit more as I thought of this and further increased my speed. Ah! Here comes the vicinity of Thiaucourt. Cutting down my motor, I glided on almost noiselessly and reached the town at about 18,000 feet altitude. 2 or 3 complete circles were made over Thiaucourt with silent engine. My eyes were all the while set upon the enemy aerodrome, which I knew occupied the smooth field just outside the little city. Some activity was apparent there, and even as I sailed above them I noticed 3 graceful albatross machines leave the ground one after the other. It was evident from their straightaway course that they were going over the lines, accumulating their elevation as they flew southward. I made myself as inconspicuous as possible until the last of the 3 had his back well towards me. Then I returned to my course and gradually narrowed the distance between us. By the time we reached Mont Sec, that celebrated mountain north of Saint Mihiel, I estimated some 3,000 feet separated me from my unsuspicious quarry. I was so eager to let them get over our lines before attacking that I quite forgot I was now a conspicuous figure to the German Archies. Two quick bursts just ahead of me informed me of my error. Without waiting to see whether or not I was hit, I put on the sauce and dived down headlong at the rearmost of the three Huns. Again I saw the warning signal sent up ahead of the three Albatross pilots. A single black burst from the battery below caused the German airmen to turn about and look behind them. They had not expected any attack from this quarter. When the leader made the first swerve aside, I was less than 200 yards from the rear Albatross. I was descending at a furious pace, regardless of everything but my target ahead. Fully 200 miles an hour my Nieuport was flying. Without checking her speed, I kept her nose pointing at the tail of the rear Albatross, which was now darting steeply downwards to escape me. As the distance closed to 50 yards, I saw my flaming bullets piercing the back of the pilot's seat. I had been firing for perhaps 10 seconds from first to last. The scared Boche had made the mistake of trying to outdive me instead of outmaneuvering me. He had paid for his blunder with his life. These thoughts flashed through my mind in the fraction of a moment. All the while during which my fingers pressed the trigger, I was conscious of the extreme danger of my position. Either or both of the other enemy machines were undoubtedly now on my tail, exactly as I had been on their unfortunate companion. And being alone, I must rely solely upon my own maneuvers to escape them. I believe I should have followed my first target all the way to the ground regardless of the consequences, so desperately had I determined to get him. So I perhaps prolonged my terrific speed a trifle too long. As the enemy airplane fell off and began to flutter, I pulled my stick back close into my seat and began a sharp climb. The notorious weakness of the Nieuport quickly announced itself. A ripping crash that sounded like the crack of doom to my ears told me that the sudden strain had collapsed my right wing. The entire spread of canvas over the top of the wing was torn off by the wind and disappeared behind me. Deprived of any supporting surface on this side, the Nieuport turned over on her right side. The tail was forced up despite all my efforts with joystick and rudder. Slowly at first, then faster and faster the tail began revolving around and around. Swifter and swifter became our downward speed. I was caught in a vrille or tailspin, and with a machine as crippled as mine there seemed not the possibility of a chance to come out of it. I wondered vaguely whether the two Albatross machines would continue to fire at me all the way down. Twice I watched them dive straight at me, always firing more bullets into my helpless little craft, notwithstanding the apparent certainty of her doom. I felt no anger towards them. I felt somewhat critical towards their bad judgment in thus wasting ammunition. No, that was not exactly it either. My senses were getting confused. What I felt critical about was their stupidity in believing I was playing possum. They were fools not to know when an airplane was actually falling to a crash. The whole spread of my fabric was gone. No pilot ever could fly without fabric on his machine. Where would I strike, I wondered. There were the woods of Mont Sec below me. Heavens! How much nearer the ground was getting! I wondered if the whole framework of the machine would disintegrate and fling me out to the mercy of the four winds. If I struck in treetops, it was barely possible that I might escape with a score of broken bones. Both Jimmy Meissner and Jimmy Hall had escaped death when betrayed through this same fault of the Nieuport. Never would I fly one again if once I got out of this fix alive. But no use worrying about that now. Either I should not be alive, or else I should be a mangled prisoner in Germany. Which would my mother rather have, I wondered. This sudden spasm of longing to see my mother again roused my fighting spirit. With that thought of her, and the idea of her opening a cablegram from the front, telling her I was dead, with that picture before my mind, a whole series of pictures of childhood scenes were vividly recalled to me. I have never before realized that one actually does see all the events of one's life pass before one's eyes at the certain approach of death. Doubtless they are but a few recollections in reality, but one's natural terror at the imminence of death multiplies them into many. I began to wonder why the speed of my vrille did not increase. With every swing around the circle I felt a regular jar as the shock of the air cushion came against the left wing after passing through the right. I felt a growing irritation at these monotonous bumps. But although I had been experimenting constantly with rudder, joystick, and even with the weight of my body, I found I was totally unable to modify in the slightest the stubborn spiral gait of the aeroplane. Fully 10,000 feet I had fallen in this manner since my wing had collapsed. I looked overboard. It was scarcely 3,000 feet more, and then the crash. I could see men standing on the road in front of a line of trucks. All were gazing white-faced at me. They were already exulting over the souvenirs they would get from my machine. from my body itself. With a vicious disregard for the consequences, I pulled open the throttle. The sudden extra speed from the newly started engine was too much for the perpendicular tail, and before I had realized it the tail was quite horizontal. Like a flash I seized the joystick and reversed my rudder. The pole of the propeller kept her straight. If only I could keep her so for 5 minutes I might make the lines. They seemed to beckon to me only 2 miles or so ahead. I looked above and below. No airplanes in the sky. My late enemies evidently were sure I was done for. Below me I saw the landscape slipping swiftly behind me. I was making headway much faster than I was falling. Sudden elation began to sweep over me. I boldly tried lifting her head. No use. She would fly straight, but that was all. Ah, here comes friend Archie. It is curious that one gets so accustomed to Archie that its terrors actually disappear. So grateful was I to the crippled little bus for not letting me down that I continued to talk to her and promise her a good rub-down when we reached the stable. I hardly realized that Archie was trying to be nasty. Over the lines I slid, a good 1,000 feet up. Once freed from the danger of landing in Germany, I tried several small tricks and succeeded in persuading the damaged craft to one more effort. I saw the roofs of my hangar before me. With the motor still running wide open, I grazed the tops of the old 94 hangar and pancaked flatly upon my field. The French pilots from an adjoining hangar came running out to see what Novus was trying to make a landing with his motor on. Later they told me I resembled a bird alighting with a broken wing. I had passed through a rather nervous experience, as I look back upon it now. Yet I do not recall that I felt anything unusual had happened as I slid over the edge of my cockpit and inquired for Reed Chambers. This is one of the curious results of flying in wartime. A species of fatalism soon possesses a pilot to such an extent that he learns to take everything as a matter of course. Rarely does a pilot betray much excitement over the day's work, no matter how extraordinary it is. So I inquired for Reed Chambers with some anger as I got out of my machine. I felt that he had deserted me. I remember that was the principal feeling that attended me across the aerodrome. Reed hadn't been heard from. But a few minutes later he blew in, full of some cock-and-bull story about my running away from him in violation of our agreement. He had been back in Germany also, and in coming out he had met the 2 Albatross machines who were then returning home to their aerodrome, possibly to get a motor car and hurry down to view my remains. Reed had not seen my combat, nor did he notice me flying my crippled bird homewards. But his report of seeing only 2 Albatross confirmed my expectations that the third had actually gone down to a final crash. Early next day the French notified us that they had indeed seen the Albatross machine crash, and had noticed my crippled Nieuport staggering homewards from the fight, surrounded with Archie. Thus they confirmed my victory without any request on my part. And the extraordinary part of the whole affair was that the dead German pilot, my latest victim, had so fallen upon his controls that the machine flew towards France and landed with his dead body a few hundred yards inside the French line. Chapter 9. Down in Flames. The 94th Squadron had been at the front about 1 month when there arrived Lieutenant Kurtz, one of my companions of the training school days. On completion of his course at the flying school, Kurtz had been selected to make a special study of aerial gunnery, in order to become an instructor to the thousands of young men who were now being drafted into Uncle Sam's aerial fleet. For this purpose he had been sent to England, and on returning to France from that country Kurtz had received orders to report to the 94th Squadron at the front in order to secure actual war experience, and to make trips over the enemy's lines. After the newcomer had asked thousands of questions and received answers to them to the best of our ability, he suggested that he should proceed to the more advanced stage of an actual combat with the enemy. As I was second in command of the squadron, being flight commander of the first flight at that time, it was my duty to arrange for him to accompany a patrol into enemy territory. No matter how much natural ability a man may possess, or how carefully he has been trained, his first experiences over the enemy lines, his first contact with enemy machines are rather trying to him. A moment's forgetfulness, a trifling foolhardiness, a slight miscalculation, and even a man who has been carefully and expensively trained, and who possesses all the characteristics of a successful pilot, may fall before the skill of a more experienced enemy flyer. For this reason I always made it a practice to accompany new pilots on their first trip over the enemy's lines, and by my advice and by actual protection when aloft, assist them over that delicate period between the theory of the school and the hard practice of battle. We were still flying the well-known baby Nieuport single-seater chasse, or fighting machine, equipped with a Gnome monosoupape motor. It was then the best machine of its kind in service, although it had some faults undeniably. Having just arrived from the rear, Kurtz was not acquainted with the peculiarities of this machine. I therefore arranged for him to make a few short flights from our field and to practice frequent landings, so that if he ever should have sudden motor trouble he would be able to come down on any ground he found available. After a few days of this practice he expressed himself as being capable of handling the machine under all circumstances, and ready for that greatest adventure of the young pilot, that first trip over enemy's lines. We agreed that Lieutenant Kurtz should accompany Lieutenant Chambers and myself on what is familiarly known as a voluntary patrol. Chambers and I were in the habit of undertaking these extra patrols when the regular day's work was over, provided we were still, to use an aviator's slang expression, mad at the Boche. It was a beautiful summer morning, bright, clear, and still, just such a morning as the Hun observation pilots would select to come over our lines and take photographs. Our plan of action was carefully explained to our new comrade. We were to fly in V formation. I was to lead, Chambers on my left, and Kurtz 100 meters behind and above us. He was not to engage in a combat, should we meet with any Boche airmen, unless the advantage was with us. I have always made it a point to avoid a fight unless I can maneuver to get the best advantage. He was at all times to maintain his position behind and above us, playing the role of a spectator. He was instructed to try out his machine gun occasionally with a few short bursts, if he had his plane pointing towards Germany. Finally, if we became scattered and he was unable to find us, he was to remember that the sun rose in the east, and, keeping it on his left, was to fly south until he felt certain that he was over French territory before making a landing. It was decided that we should start after breakfast, promptly at 8 o'clock, meet over the field at 1,500 feet, get our full altitude between Nancy and Toul, and cross over the lines at 15,000 feet. Before starting I noticed that Lieutenant Kurtz appeared rather nervous, but this was not a matter for surprise under the circumstances. Little did I understand the reason for this nervousness then, or suspect in what a tragic manner it would later be revealed to me. Lieutenant Kurtz's machine was climbing badly, so we got up to an altitude of 14,500 feet, rather slowly. At that height I decided to pass from the comparative safety of our own side of the line to the hazard and adventure of the German positions. Mr. Hun was abroad, for I caught sight of the shimmer of what I believed to be a photoplane 6 miles inside our lines and very high up, probably 19,000 feet. As this enemy was certainly beyond our reach, I decided to keep the nose of my machine headed towards Germany, and to continue to gain altitude as steadily as possible, at the same time keeping an eye on this nearby enemy, for there was just a chance that we might be able to reach his altitude and head him off before his work was done. Suddenly, little fleecy white puffs appeared in the clear atmosphere ahead and above us. This anti-aircraft activity of ours meant that more Huns were abroad in our vicinity. A few minutes more and we had spotted them. 3 powerful single-seaters of the Albatross type, 1,500 feet above us and about half a mile ahead. As a signal to the others, I wigwagged my wings, which is the aviator's way of saying, "Look out and keep your eye on the leader." I had time to look back and see that Lieutenant Kurtz was well in the rear and a little higher than the enemy then appeared to be. There was then no reason to fear for him. It was not necessary to give any thought to an experienced fighter like Lieutenant Chambers. I had been out enough with Reed to know that he was the equal to any 2 Huns. Doubtless Reed had seen the Boche before I had, for he was keeping close by me, probably wondering what my plan was going to be. Keeping a close watch on our opponents, I rapidly analyzed the situation. The enemy had the advantage in height. There were 3, probably all experienced men, while we were 2 fighters and 1 novice, who was catching sight of a German plane for the first time in his life. But the enemy pilots were inside our lines. Down below, several hundreds of men in the trenches were watching what to them was to be an equal fight, 3 Americans against 3 Germans. With their field glasses the French officers had picked out the black German crosses and noted the red, blue, and white rings of the U.S. machines. Doubtless at that very moment they were discussing the outcome of the impending fight. They had the right to expect a fight, since we were 3-3, so a fight it should be. In the minds of the Germans there appeared to be no element of doubt or hesitation. Having the advantage of height, they suddenly, all 3, swooped down on us. First one, then the second, and the third dived down and sprayed us with bullets from their machine guns. I had time to notice that Lieutenant Chambers banked up on a wingtip and dived down. I did a half free, and in less time than it takes to tell, we were both out of range. The Germans in their diving attack had not only failed to get any of us, but had also lost their advantage of height. The tables were turned, or at any rate the conditions were equal, and retreat was evidently the uppermost thought in the minds of the Huns. We gave chase, and in a few minutes I had succeeded in separating one of the planes from the formation. It was then either his life or mine. Perhaps I should get in the fatal shot, or maybe luck would be on his side. In either case, I was determined that it should be a fight to the death. Occupied as I was with my own enemy, I yet had time to notice that Lieutenant Kurtz was doing well. He and Lieutenant Chambers were in full cry after the two remaining Albatross planes. The whole show was proceeding in the direction of St. Mihiel. Mine was a running fight until we arrived over Thiaucourt, the little city about 6 miles inside the German lines. Here my enemy decided that conditions were in his favor, for he swung around and headed straight for me. But I was satisfied to accept the challenge, for I was 100 yards behind and about 200 yards above my opponent, and this gave me a not to be despised advantage. Nearer and nearer he came, heading towards me in a climbing virage, and working both his machine guns furiously. It is a sensation which almost defies description. There we were, only a few yards apart, sparring around one another like two prize fighters in a celestial ring. His incendiary explosive bullets were cracking all around me, and any one of them, if it touched a vital spot, was capable of putting an end to the fight. But my feelings were not personal. Indeed, in those few critical moments which constitute the turning point of a fight, the aviator usually has all thoughts of self driven away. With a quick half turn of a vrille, I secured a position on the tail of my enemy. I was then in such a position that he was unable to turn his gun on me. It was my chance, a chance which probably would be lost in the next fraction of a second, but I had no intention of losing it. With a pull on both triggers, a hail of bullets swept towards the German plane. Down he swooped. Apparently he was out of control. Would he crash, or would he be able, after that giddy dive, to pull out and make a safe landing? That I could not tell, for while the spinning nose-dive of an enemy always looks like certain destruction, it is often, in the hands of an artful pilot, the only highway to safety. Had I been over our own lines, I might have followed him down and made certain of his crash. If I saw that he had regained control, I could then immediately renew the fight at a lower altitude. But I was well inside enemy territory and only 10,000 feet above ground. It was quite possible that while I had been occupied in this fight, other enemy planes had gathered overhead and were preparing to wreak vengeance. Personal safety and the elementary rules of aerial fighting require the pilot in such circumstances to regain altitude or get back to the lines as soon as possible. Thus I had to leave the issue of my fight in doubt. I had a faint hope that some other observer might be able to confirm the enemy's crash, and so allow me to place one more Hun to my credit. A few minutes later, and I realized that my recent instinctive fears were only too true. High above, but fortunately a considerable distance away from me, approached two German planes, which I rapidly concluded were the two machines which had succeeded in escaping from Kurtz and Chambers, and were now determined to punish me when they discovered me so remotely isolated from my formation. My only hope of safety lay in speed. Often and often on the racetrack, with wide open throttle, every nerve taut, every pent-up ounce of energy concentrated in my arms, have I wished that I could infuse just a little more power into my engine, could give just a little more speed to my car, in order to draw away from the man whose car was creeping up to and overhauling mine inch by inch. But this case was even more crucial. Speed now meant safety. Speed here meant life. My motor was flung wide open. The nose of my machine was turned down, and I raced as I had never raced before, for the prize was life itself. But do what I could, it was impossible to shake off one of my opponents. Now I was directly over the lines. A few minutes more and I should be in our own territory, and in a position either to land or to get away from my persistent rival. However, the advantage the other fellow had in height was too much for me, and I realized that it was best for me to turn round and fight. In a flash I had kicked my tail around and was heading towards my opponent. He swooped down, reserving his fire, while I kept my fingers on the triggers of my guns. I had him in range, but I hesitated. The thought had flashed through my brain that perhaps in 3 seconds more I should be able to shoot with more deadly effect. Now I had my sights on him. Now was the time to release both guns. At that very moment his machine banked up on one wingtip, and there under the lower wing I saw the concentric red, blue, and white wings of the United States Air Service. The supposed Hun was friend Chambers, who was returning from chasing the enemy, and the second plane was that of Lieutenant Kurtz, back from his first aerial scrap. God only knows why I held my fire for that brief fraction of a second. In talking it over later, Chambers said, "When I saw Rick swing round in that wild fashion, I realized that he was still mad at the Boche, and thought the time had come to let him see my colors." It is not often that a man rises to the degree of joy I felt as we headed for home, the fight over and all three safe. I had every reason to believe my German was down. Possibly Chambers had got another, and Kurtz, for his first time over, had deported himself wonderfully. I searched around for the pilot Kurtz, whom I regarded as being in my care, but to my surprise was unable to find him. I cruised around for a few minutes, searching in every direction, but not one plane could I see in the sky. I argued to myself that he must have gone home, and in consequence I turned my machine towards our aerodrome, hoping to pick him up at any moment. Just as I got sight of our landing ground, my anxiety was relieved, for there, ahead of and below us, was Lieutenant Kurtz, making rings above our field, exactly as I had advised him to do. Lieutenant Kurtz was evidently on his last turn over an adjoining field prior to landing, when to my unspeakable horror I saw his Nieuport drop into a vrille and crash straight to earth, after which burst of angry flames shot up all around him. What could possibly have happened? If help could be got to him without a moment's delay, he might be pulled out of that wreckage before the flames consumed him. But I could not get to him, for the place where his machine had crashed was among barbed wire entanglements and trenchworks so thick that a safe landing was impossible. Below was a road, only 50 yards from the burning machine, and on the road was a French camion. I speeded down, shut off my motor, and by signs and voice urged the driver to go to the rescue. The man stood still and watched. I realized later that he understood it was a hopeless task, for all the ammunition in the wrecked plane was exploding, and for any man to approach meant almost certain death. Unable to land close by, I sped on to our own field, jumped out of my plane almost before it had stopped rolling, vaulted into the saddle of a motorcycle, and raced towards the scene of the disaster with a vague, wild hope that I might yet be able to do some good. Could I live for 1,000,000 years, I should not forget that awful sight of the charred remains of the man who had been my companion in the schools, and who only one brief hour before had set out with me full of life and hope. A few hours later the mystery of that crash was revealed. As already had been mentioned, I had noticed before starting that Lieutenant Kurtz appeared nervous, but had not given the matter any great consideration. The explanation was given by a brother officer who had come with Lieutenant Kurtz to the squadron. Before starting on his last flight, Lieutenant Kurtz had confided to him that he was subject to fainting spells when exposed to high altitudes, and the only thing he was afraid of was that he might be seized with such a fit while in the air. Alas, his fear had been only too well founded. But what a pity it was he had not confided this fear to me, his flight commander. The next morning a simple funeral procession wound its way down the leafy lanes, the while shells passed overhead with an incongruous whine. Awaiting me at the camp on my return from this sad ceremony was an official notice from the French commander. It stated, briefly, that an infantry officer on outpost duty in No Man's Land had observed that the German I had fought with had crashed to the ground a total wreck. I had got my Boche, but I had lost a friend, and he had perished in the manner most dreaded of all aviators, for he had gone down in flames. Chapter 10. Lufbery is killed. Lieutenant Walter Smith of New York came to me on the morning of May 10th, 1918, and said, "Rick, where do you find all these Boche of yours over the lines?" I asked him what he meant by all. "Why," he said, "I've been over the lines 2 or 3 times, and I haven't had a single look at an enemy machine. I would like to go across with someone like you, who always gets into some fun. Will you take me with you on a voluntary patrol?" This was the spirit I like to see in a pilot, and I immediately told Smith I would take him over at 9 o'clock this very morning if he could get ready. My regular patrol was not on until late in the afternoon, so I had all the morning to myself. Smith was delighted with the invitation and immediately made himself ready. We left the field together and sped quickly towards St. Mihiel. Our altimeters indicated 17,000 feet as we finished our first patrol and found ourselves over the city of Pont-à-Mousson. No enemy machines had been encountered. Considering it quite probable that a Rumpler might be coming out for photographs on such a nice morning as this, I determined to cut a slice off the German territory on our next patrol and run directly from Pont-à-Mousson to Verdun. Accordingly, I set off with Smith close by my right wing. A slight northerly course brought us directly over Mar-le-Tour, where I knew was located a fighting squadron of Germans. We should satisfy Smith's curiosity even if we had to descend onto the Hun aerodrome. As we crossed the little town of Mar-la-Tour, I detected a German two-seater making off towards Verdun almost directly ahead of us. It was an albatross, and was several thousand feet below us and about 2 miles ahead. We were in excellent position, for not only was our presence entirely unsuspected so far in his rear, but once discovered we had the sun at our backs and had the advantage in height and in numbers. I felt certain of the outcome of the fight, and was warmly congratulating Smith upon his good judgment in picking me as his leader in today's expedition, as I dipped him a signal and began setting our course into the sun. By the time we reached Conflans, I was just above the enemy's tail and in an excellent position. As yet, we had remained unperceived. I stuck down my Nieuport and began my dive. My tracer bullets sped by the startled observer, and gave him the first intimation that he had of my proximity. The German pilot must have seen them flash past too. For the next thing I knew was that in some way or other I had passed the albatross and was still wildly firing into vacancy, while the two-seater enemy machine by one masterful maneuver had given me the go-by and was now on top of me. Clearly he was an old hand at this game, and it behooved me to be careful. I zoomed up again and got the upper berth, but this time I found it extremely difficult to get into a position for shooting. The pilot kicked around his tail so adroitly that every time I prepared to dive upon him I found the observer coolly sighting a brace of machine guns full into my face. Moreover, I found that at this high altitude the albatross could maneuver as well or just a little better than could my lighter Nieuport. Once I tried to make a sharp bank to the right. I had quite forgotten the rarity of the air and, instead of a virage, I found I had thrown my machine into a vrille. 2 complete revolutions were made before I could get myself straightened out. Then looking about me for my enemy, I found the albatross nearly a mile away from me making a fast spurt for home. Smith was composedly sailing along above me, appearing to be quite enchanted with the entertainment. I had encountered an expert pair of air fighters on the albatross, and I looked after their departing shadow with some admiration, solving my disappointment. Then much of my self-satisfied abandon evaporated instantly when I began to realize that Smith and I were over 25 miles inside Germany. I decided to retreat while retreating was good, fully satisfied that I had given Smith his money's worth in the shape of a first show. As we passed over St. Mihiel on our way home, I perceived White Archies bursting, back in the direction of Verdun. Closer scrutiny disclosed the same albatross two-seater quietly riding the air bumps and making steadfastly for our side of the lines. The pilots thought they had me bluffed and were going on with their work in full view of Smith and myself. I wiggled a signal to Smith and started again in pursuit of the foxy albatross. But immediately the enemy made an about face and re-entering the barrage of Archie, set out at a stiff gait for Mar-la-Tour and home. I swerved a bit to the right to cut him off and glanced about me as I did so to ascertain the exact position of Smith. He was nowhere in sight. Below me was Étain. I was at least 10 miles back of the lines. When had Smith left me, and in what direction had he gone? Feeling more than a little uncomfortable in my thoughts at having neglected to look out for him in the last few minutes, I made a half bank and set my course straight for home. As I learned, late that afternoon, Smith had landed inside our lines with motor troubles and was unable to reach our aerodrome until near nightfall. As I neared our aerodrome, I saw a large crowd gathered together on the center of the field. It was just 10:50 in the morning when I landed beside them and hastened up to learn what calamity had overtaken my poor friend Smith. If through my carelessness Smith had become engaged in an unequal combat and had been wounded or crashed upon landing, I could not escape the responsibility for his loss. I hurried over to the hangars, filled with apprehension. The exclamations I heard only bewildered me the more. Major Lufbery's name was on everybody's lips. I asked if anyone had seen Lieutenant Smith come in. The boys only looked at me vacantly and made no reply. Finally, I demanded the reason for this extraordinary gathering on the field. The answer left me dumb with dismay and horror. Our beloved Luff was no more. Major Raoul Lufbery, the American ace of aces, the most revered American aviator in France, had just been shot down in flames not 6 miles away from our field. This sad story is so well known to the whole world that I would not repeat here the details of Lufbery's last fight, were it not for the fact that numerous false stories of his heroic death were spread broadcast throughout America immediately after the news of his loss had been cabled home. Several of these garbled accounts later came to my attention. As our commanding officer, Major Huffer, tells the story, it was about 10 o'clock when the anti-aircraft guns on top of Mount Mihiel began belching great white puffs of smoke overhead at a very high altitude. An alert came to us immediately that a German photographing machine was coming our way and was at that moment almost directly over our field. Lieutenant Good was the only pilot on the field ready for flight. He was sent up alone to attack the intruder, an incident which brought vastly regrettable results. It was Good's first actual combat. His encounter with the enemy was plainly seen by all the spectators who were gathered about our hangars. Just as Good left the ground, the French Archie ceased firing. Evidently they had scored a hit, for the German observing machine at that moment began a long vrille, spinning faster and faster as it drew nearer to the ground. Just as the onlookers were convinced that the enemy machine was falling for its last crash, the Albatross recovered its poise, straightened out at less than 200 feet above earth, and turned back towards the German lines. Almost immediately Lieutenant Good flew in to the attack. Good began firing at an impossible range and continued firing until his ammunition was exhausted, without inflicting any appreciable injury upon the two-seater Albatross. As he came flying home, the Archie batteries in the neighborhood again took up the battle and poured up a violent barrage which surrounded and encompassed this lone enemy on every side. But all to no purpose. The Albatross continued steadily on its retreat, climbing slightly and setting a course in the direction of Nancy. In the meantime, Major Lufbery, who had been watching the whole show from his barracks, jumped on a motorcycle that was standing in the road and rushed to the hangars. His own plane was out of commission. Another Nieuport was standing on the field, apparently ready for use. It belonged to Lieutenant Davis. The mechanics admitted everything was ready, and without another word Lufbery jumped into the machine and immediately took off. With all his long string of victories, Lufbery had never brought down an enemy airplane within Allied lines. All 17 of his early successes with the Escadrille Lafayette, and his last success, when he had gone out to avenge Jimmy Hall, all had been won across the German lines. He had never seen the wreckage of a single one of his victories. Undoubtedly he seized this opportunity of engaging in a combat almost within sight of our field with impetuous abandon. Knowing nothing of the condition of his guns, nor the small peculiarities of his present mount, Lufbery flew in to the attack. With far greater speed than his heavier antagonist, Major Lufbery climbed in pursuit. In approximately 5 minutes after leaving the ground he had reached 2,000 feet and had arrived within range of the Albatross 6 miles away. The first attack was witnessed by all our watchers. Luff fired several short bursts as he dived in to the attack. Then he swerved away and appeared to busy himself with his gun, which evidently had jammed. Another circle over their heads and he had cleared the jam. Again he rushed the enemy from their rear, when suddenly old Luff's machine was seen to burst into roaring flames. He passed the Albatross and proceeded for 3 or 4 seconds on a straight course. Then to the horrified watchers below there appeared the figure of their gallant hero emerging in a headlong leap from the midst of the fiery furnace. Lufbery had preferred to leap to certain death rather than endure the slow torture of burning to a crisp. His body fell in the garden of a peasant woman's house in a little town just north of Nancy. A small stream ran by at about 100 yards distant, and it was thought later that poor Lufbery, seeing the small chance for life, had jumped with the intention of striking this water. He had leaped from a height of 200 feet, and his machine was carrying him at a speed of 120 miles per hour. A hopeless but a heroic attempt to preserve his priceless life for his needy country. While I was listening to the details of this shocking story, the telephone rang. We were informed by a French officer of the exact spot upon which our late hero had fallen. Jumping into a motor, we sped across the intervening miles at a prodigious rate, and arrived at the scene of the tragedy less than 30 minutes after Luff had fallen. But already loving hands had removed his body. The townsfolk had carried all that remained of poor Raoul Lufbery to their little town hall, and there we found him, his charred figure entirely covered with flowers from the nearby gardens. I remember a conversation we had had with Major Lufbery on the subject of catching a fire in the air a few days previous to this melancholy accident. I had asked Luff what he would do in a case of this kind, jump or stay with the machine. All of us had a vast respect for Major Lufbery's experience, and we all leaned forward to hear his response to this question. "I should always stay with the machine," Luff responded. "If you jump, you certainly haven't got a chance. On the other hand, there is always a good chance of side-slipping your airplane down in such a way that you fan the flames away from yourself and the wings. Perhaps you can even put the fire out before you reach the ground. It has been done. I'm for staying with the old bus every time." What an irony now to recall old Luff's instructions. His machine had received a flaming bullet in the fuel tank. The same bullet evidently cut away the thumb of his right hand as it clasped the joystick. The next instant the little craft was but one mass of flame, from which there was no means of escape. Leaving instructions to send the body to the American hospital near our aerodrome, we returned to our field. There we learned 1 or 2 climaxes to Lufbery's combat and death. Captain de Rode, the commanding officer of a French escadrille nearby, met us and stated that one of his pilots, in fact his leading ace, had witnessed the death of Lufbery and had immediately taken up the pursuit of the Albatross to revenge him. At the first attack he too was shot through the heart and fell immediately. His machine had crashed but a mile or two from the spot where Luff had fallen. But the German machine was finally shot down by another French machine, and it fell a mile inside our lines, where both pilot and observer were captured. Upon inquiring for Doug Campbell, we then learned he too had gone up to seek revenge for Major Lufbery's death. An hour later he returned and reported that the Albatross had secured too great a start for him, but that he had encountered a two-seater Rumpler over Beaumont, and after a brisk combat he had killed the rear gunner and wounded the pilot. The machine fell within our lines, both wings having been torn off in its rapid descent without control. Stoically receiving our congratulations, Douglas assured us that this Rumpler was but one of many that the Huns would give us in the attempt to pay for the loss of Raoul Lufbery. And well has Douglas Campbell kept his promise. His brother came to lunch with us that day. Doug had expected him. His brother was an officer in a corps of engineers, which was stationed but a short distance away at Gondrecourt, and Douglas had invited him over to mess with us this particular day. As soon as he arrived, Lieutenant Campbell informed Douglas that it was very gallant of him to go up and shoot down an enemy airplane before his very eyes, on this day of his luncheon party. He said he would like to drive over and see what the wreck of the German airplane looked like after falling 16,000 feet. So immediately after lunch, Major Huffer took the two Campbells and myself in his car, and we crawled up to the front and parked the car in some woods as near to Beaumont as we could get. Our own big guns were well behind us, sending their long whining shells over our heads about 10 every second. We walked forward half a mile with due caution, and finally came to the spot where Douglas Campbell's victims lay. 2 or 3 French poilus had been placed on guard over the wreckage by the French colonel in charge of this sector. The wings lay several hundred feet away from the fuselage. We collected some souvenirs of Doug's victory and made our way homeward. It was rare enough that an aviator ever set eyes upon any part of the machine he had shot down. Usually the enemy machine fell far within German lines, for the German policy was to fight only above their own territory. If we were ever fortunate enough to catch a Boche inside our lines and down him there, the last scrap of his machine was carried away by the men in the trenches or by the lorry drivers who happened to be in the vicinity, long before the victorious pilot appeared upon the scene. As we reached home with our enemy's souvenirs, we were again faced with the sorrowful realization that old Luff would never more sit in the group around our cheerful mess table. It was on the following day, May 20th, that the last remains of our beloved hero was to be laid away in our little airmen's cemetery. Already the little plot bore this name, and quite half a dozen of our fellows lay side by side in this foreign clay, so far distant from the land and dear ones they loved. They were now to be joined by one whom all France and America considered preeminent in aviation. General Gerard, the commander of the Sixth Army, arrived with his entire staff at 1 o'clock. General Leger, commanding the 26th Division, came with Colonel William Mitchell, commanding the Air Forces of America. All bore with them quantities of beautiful flowers. Hundreds of officers from all branches of the service came to pay their last act of respect to the memory of America's most famous aviator. I watched the great assemblage gather. Their flowers covered the casque of the dead airman and formed a huge pyramid beside it. At 1:30 I hurried back to the aerodrome. I had one last flight to make in conjunction with my comrade of so many patrols. The pilots of Flight No. 1 were strapped in seats and awaiting me. Our mechanics silently handed us our baskets of flowers. Leaving the field in flight formation, we circled over the hospital plot until 5 minutes to 2. The last of the procession had passed up the short stretch of road, and the aviator's last resting place was filled with Lufbery's friends. I flew my formation twice across the mass of uncovered heads below, then glided with closed engine down to 50 feet above the open grave. As his body was being slowly lowered, I dropped my flowers, every pilot behind me following in my wake one by one. Returning then to our vacant aerodrome, we sorrowfully faced the realization that America's greatest aviator and ace of aces had been laid away for his last rest. Chapter 11. Squadron Festivities. The monotony of dud days on the aerodrome exacts a cost from aviators which cannot be computed nor definitely ascertained, but seasoned squadron commanders have learned that their pilots live longer and fight better if they are helped through these dull periods with occasional amusements. Especially is this true where leaves of absence are infrequent. The British, who are past masters in this art of caring for their men, not only established a regular schedule of holidays for their pilots, But even while they lived on aerodromes, all pilots were required to take part in a certain amount of athletic sports, games, and friendly visits back and forth between squadrons. Movie shows, whist tournaments, long walks, and other methods of inducing the pilots to take their minds off their work served to produce a morale and esprit in the British aviators that has not its equal in the world. With the American forces several influences prevented this happy solution to a trying problem. We were new to the game, and had not yet learned to study the psychology of the flyer. We had too few aviators at the front to permit them regular and frequent leaves of absence. We had pressing work before us that could not be disturbed for experimentation. Those high in authority considered it more necessary to ship infantry to France than to increase the number of pilots in aviation. Consequently, the few that were first sent to the front served steadily through to the end, almost without a day's leave being granted for rest and recuperation of spirits. It is said that the work of the war pilots exacts more strain from the individual than is the case with his brothers at arms in any other arm of warfare. Perhaps he does live under a more constant strain. I cannot judge of the truth of this, for I am not familiar enough with all the details of the other man's work. But the fact that the aviator knows he is constantly under the possibility of sudden death every time he sets foot in his machine, whether it be death from bullets and shells or from the possible collapse of his machine in mid-air, this constant nerving of mind and body against the daily perils which surround him undoubtedly counts heavily against his strength after many weeks of daily service. The wise commanding officer therefore provides as much amusement and recreation for his pilots as the circumstances of war permit. On May 25th our squadron adjutant, Lieutenant Smith, had the good fortune to meet in Meilly-le-Tour the two Herring sisters from the old USA, who were at the front giving entertainments for our soldiers in France under the auspices of the Red Cross organization. Lieutenant Smith immediately called upon the two young ladies and secured a promise from them to come out to Toul and give us a performance at our aerodrome. They very kindly agreed to come the very next afternoon. Upon receipt of the news we began our preparations at the field. One of the largest French hangars, which was then in use by a photographing squadron, was emptied of its machines and equipment and was cleaned up for the occasion. Everybody enthusiastically turned in to help, and after a few hours' work we had the theater ready. A stage was set up at one end and electric lights were arranged with artistic theatrical effect. A captured German piano was brought over from one of the messes and the dirt floor was swept and polished. The Misses Herring arrived at 4 o'clock and found officers and men all impatiently awaiting them. Even the Frenchmen, who still occupied part of our aerodrome, were on hand, anxious to see and hear this all-American show. It was a wonderful entertainment for all of us, and I am sure the Misses Herring have never received more enthusiastic and sincere applause from any audience. After the show was over, we invited the girls over to our squadron mess, and at the end of a very merry meal we all went out to put them in their car and see them safely started on their way. Just as the car was starting, I put my head inside the curtains and inquired of them their next destination. They told me they were going to Lange, a town not many miles distant from Toul, and very cordially invited me to come over and see them and have dinner with them some evening during the following week. I naturally accepted with every indication of pleasure, and proceeded to make definite arrangements with them as to just what afternoon I should arrange for a flight and come down a pan in the neighborhood of Lange, when I heard a chuckle behind me. I withdrew my head from the curtains and found myself face to face with the C.O. Major Huffer eyed me for a moment with a ghost of a smile on his face, as much as to say, "I overheard everything, my boy, and I don't think you will pan near Lange during the next week." C.O.'s can take a lot of joy out of life. Next day Douglas Campbell, who was running neck and neck with me for the squadron record, won a celebrated victory. He went out on a little private expedition of his own, and while in the vicinity of Pont-à-Mousson, he saw a formation of the British Independent Air Force coming home from a bombing raid on Thionville, an important railway town some 30 miles north of Metz. Some of these British bombing squadrons occupied an aerodrome only a few miles south of our own, and we frequently met them going or coming across the lines. They flew de Havilland two-seaters with Liberty motor, and each machine carried almost a ton of bombs. About 20 of these bombing squadrons were under the command of General Hugh Trenchard, the greatest authority on war aviation in the world, in my opinion, and they were designated as the Independent Air Force because they were not subject to any army orders. Their one function was to drop bombs on German cities. Lieutenant Campbell noticed one of the British machines had dropped back almost a mile behind the others as they were returning homeward from their expedition. No fighting machines ever accompanied these bombers. They relied solely upon their close flying formation to beat off all attackers. Evidently this straggler had motor trouble, for he could not keep up his altitude and was slowly dropping farther and farther behind his formation. To make his situation more desperate, he was at that moment being attacked simultaneously by 3 Falls fighting planes. Without hesitation, Doug dived down to his rescue. Keeping the eastern sun at his back, Campbell executed a long but rapid circle which brought him onto the rear of the enemy formation without being seen. He aimed for the nearest falls and nearly shot him down with almost his first burst. Turning savagely upon the other 2 Falls machines, he gave them burst after burst. Both turned tail and began diving for safety. Chasing the 2 Huns back for a few miles until he was satisfied they would not check their speed this side of their aerodrome, the American turned back and quickly overtook the crippled British de Havilland. Escorting the pilot and observer well back to their destination, Campbell waved them goodbye and made for home. An hour later the commanding officer of the English squadron telephoned us, asking for the name of our plucky pilot who had downed 1 Hun and driven away from their intended victim 2 others. He stated that the British pilot and the observer had both been wounded by the Falls attackers, and had it not been for the timely arrival of Lieutenant Campbell, both would undoubtedly have been killed. The next morning Lieutenant Campbell and I started out together on a voluntary patrol to see if we couldn't bag a few Hun machines. It was May 28th. We set out from the aerodrome at about 9 o'clock under a beautiful clear sky and drove straight for the lines in the direction of Pont-à-Mousson. We were careful to keep inside our own lines so that the Hun Archie would not betray our presence to the enemy's aeroplanes. 4 or 5 patrols were made back and forth between Pont-à-Mousson and Saint-Mihiel. About an hour after we had left home I noticed a formation of machines approaching us from the vicinity of Mar-le-Tour. It was evident that they must be enemy machines, since they came from that direction and were attracting no burst of Archie from the German gunners of that locality. I dropped a signal to Campbell and began a southerly climb for greater altitude. Reaching 18,000 feet, I turned and headed back towards the enemy lines. Now the members of the advancing formation were quite distinguishable, and I made out 2 Albatross 2-seater fighting machines coming towards us at about 16,000 feet, and above them 4 Falls single-seater fighting machines were accompanying them as protectors. Undoubtedly the expedition was planned for taking important photographs, and a strong defense had come along to enable the Albatross to accomplish their missions despite any attacks from our side. We had about 2,000 feet altitude over them, but we needed all the advantage we could possibly get against such odds. So I withdrew, still, into the sun, and waited until the whole formation had crossed the lines and were well on our side before turning for the attack. As soon as we began our dive we were observed. The 2 Albatross immediately turned tail and started for the lines. The 4 fighting planes drew closer their formation and also turned back, keeping themselves between us and the machines they were protecting. Although the long range was hopeless, Campbell and I both fired occasional bursts as we continued after them, always preserving our advantage in altitude and never permitting them a shot at us. In this fashion we all crossed the lines again, and soon we were above the city of Thiaucourt, Campbell and I still holding the upper floor. Apparently the Huns began to tire of this humiliating game, for at this juncture we suddenly noticed a breaking up of their formation. The 2 Albatross machines began circling back of Thiaucourt, while the 4 Falls struck off for the east and began climbing towards the Moselle Valley. We watched this neat little maneuver for a few moments. Then, to test the crafty trap which was so evidently being laid for us, we suddenly dived, or made a feint at a dive, upon the 2 abandoned Albatross machines. Campbell went straight down upon the nearest one, while I stayed above him and kept an eye upon the 4 fighting machines. Instantly the 4 fighting planes reversed their direction and came hurrying back for a rescue. Douglas zoomed craftily back to a position just below me, and we continued a slow retreat towards our lines. The Falls maintained a safe position well in our rear. Again the tricky Huns undertook a fancy maneuver. We saw one of the Albatross suddenly draw away towards the west, flying directly towards Saint-Mihiel, while the other ceased its circling and hastened to overtake the 4 fighting planes ahead of him. They waited until he had overtaken them, then all 5 turned to the east towards the Moselle, leaving the lone Albatross an attractive bait for us 2 miles in their rear. With extreme care we estimated the exact distances that now separated us. Fully aware of the new trap that was laid for us, it was only a question of our ability to get down at the bait and dispose of him, and then regain our altitude before the superior enemy formation could descend upon us. Our judgment was as good as theirs. Our position was a little better, for we could estimate better than they the distance from our point in the sky to the slow-moving albatross left as a decoy in the west. Better still, we knew to an inch the capabilities of our Nieuport, and perhaps the Huns would underestimate our speed. A fraction of an instant was all the mistake they need make, and they made it. Like a flash, we turned our aeroplanes and side by side dived swiftly down on the lone albatross, with our throttles full open. The Falls machines instantly turned to the pursuit, but even as they did so, they must have realized the futility of the chase, for not only did we have a mile or more handicap, but we rapidly increased this distance between us. As we neared our target, we nursed our machines until our gun sights were directly upon the enemy albatross. About 100 shots each we fired before we eased off our machines and began to climb away to regain our altitude. Looking back, we saw we had done a complete job with our albatross. It swooped one way and then the other, and, finally falling into a last vrille, we saw it crash at the edge of the town of Fleuré, just inside the Hrata woods. Long before the final crash of our victim, Campbell and I had regained our former altitude. Then came the surprise of the day. Instead of dashing after us to wreak their well-earned revenge, the 4 Hun fighters returned hastily to their remaining albatross, and surrounding it began carefully conducting it northwards still deeper within their own territory. Many times later did I observe this craven characteristic of the enemy air fighters. No matter what their superiority in numbers or position, if we succeeded in bringing down one of their number, the others almost invariably abandoned the combat and gave us the field. It may be military efficiency, but it always appeared to me to be pure yellowness. Campbell and I were both content to let them go. No sooner had the Falls machines pulled away than the Archie batteries below us began target practice. They had had time to calculate our position to a relative nicety in all this time, and they got in some really creditable work. I sheered off towards home, but Campbell, who comes from the same breed as Jimmy Hall, made me wait for him while he returned into the barrage and captivated the German gunners below with his American aerial contortions, the barrage of shrapnel in the meantime getting very much like an Iowa hailstorm. After satisfying himself that they understood his contempt for them, Doug consented to come along home with me. We crossed the lines without suffering a hit, and soon were taxiing our victorious little Nieuport across the field to the doors of our hangar. We had scarcely gotten out of our seats when Douglas received news that completely dissipated the joy of his victory. Lieutenant John Mitchell, a brother of our colonel and dear chum of Douglas Campbell, had been killed that morning in landing his machine at Colombey-les-Belles. Campbell and Mitchell were college chums, had entered aviation together, and had sailed for France from New York on the same steamer. They were inseparable, and all their friends thought of them as two brothers. Poor Doug was inconsolable. Friendships in flying squadrons are curious affairs. Where it is one's daily business to go out looking for trouble, it is plainly imperative that one keep oneself always fit and clear-minded. It would never do so to occupy one's mind with emotions of love or friendship that one's fighting perceptions are dulled. The enemy's mind can be counted upon to be burdened with no such heavy weight. It is a matter of life or death to every air fighter, this quick-thinking, unburdened mind. Hence I had steeled my heart against that intimate kind of friendship with my comrades that prostrates one upon the death of a friend. When Jim Miller went down, I learned that necessary stoicism. Later Jimmy Hall went, and Lufbery. Many others were to follow, and well I knew it. Close as our friendships were, living and working side by side with common purposes and mutual interdependence, all the pilots of '94, I believe, eventually came to look with a callous indifference upon the sudden death of their dearest chum. This necessity is to my mind one of the greatest horrors of the war. Lieutenant Smith used to talk to me about his old mother in New York. She was a widow, and he an only son. She was in ill health, and he was haunted with the belief that a visit from him would do much to bring her back to good health and spirits. I liked Smith immensely from the first, possibly at first because he had so flattered me with his request to go with me on voluntary patrols, but subsequently I found that he had the ability and character of a wonderful pilot, and he was a reliable companion in a fight. Various men in my squadron appealed to me in various ways, but Smith got so close to me by some attractive quality in his nature that I sometimes dreamed of him at night, picturing him battling against desperate odds in the air or being shot down in flames. Smith had an unfailing fund of good nature and humor. One morning, shortly after my last exploit with Douglas Campbell, Lieutenant Smith again came to me and asked me to take him on a second expedition. We agreed to go on the following morning at 4 o'clock. I might say for the benefit of those who have never been out of bed at 4 o'clock that it is always raw and chilly at that hour in the morning. And when one climbs up to 20,000 feet in the air and cruises about for an hour or so with nothing more than a cup of coffee under one's belt, it requires some little enthusiasm in one's nature to derive unmixed pleasure out of it. On this morning in question, Smith and I got up to 22,000 feet over Pont-à-Mousson and Fleury. The temperature at this altitude was probably close to 50 degrees below zero. We expected to find some early bird of the Germans coming over the lines to take their customary photographs, and it was necessary for us to have the topmost ceiling to escape his attention. After an hour of fruitless searching, I led off again to the west, this time a little deeper within German lines. To my surprise, I noticed Smith suddenly turn towards home and soon disappear from my sight. Supposing he had been let down by a faulty motor, I continued my patrol for another hour, saw one enemy plane, which also saw me, and escaped me without a combat, until finally despairing of finding any game before my fuel was completely exhausted, I returned to the field after almost 2½ hours in the air. Lieutenant Smith came up to my machine as I shut off the motor. "Hello, Eskimo," he greeted me with some savageness. "Why didn't you stay up all day?" I asked him why he had come down. He looked at me a moment and then began to laugh. "Rick," he said, "I am frozen so stiff yet that if I laugh out loud I will break in two. I don't know just how high up we were, but I'll swear that I saw the sun rising for tomorrow morning." The Nieuport is a cold berth in high altitudes, and one must dress for the part. When I learned that Smith had worn only his ordinary clothing, I could easily fancy that today's sun might look to him like the one due a week hence. Chapter 12. Jimmy Meissner Again. Such was the liaison between the Allied forces on our sector of the front in the spring of 1918 that we were frequently called upon to act in concert with the infantry or the air forces of the French and British. Thus, on Decoration Day, when all the thoughts from our aerodrome were directed towards the significance of the celebration that our people back home were planning for this occasion, a call came from the British Independent Air Force Headquarters that an important expedition was being carried out that morning at 8 o'clock against the German railroad station at Conflans, and it would be appreciated if we Americans could furnish them some protection on their homeward journey. Accordingly, Lieutenant Meissner was given charge of a formation of 6 Nieuport from 94 Squadron, and Lieutenant John Mitchell led a similar formation of 6 machines from the 95th, all of which left our aerodrome on this mission. They were to rendezvous over Thiaucourt, which was about halfway to Conflans from the front. This Lieutenant John Mitchell of 95 Squadron must not be confused with the other John Mitchell, our colonel's brother, killed, as already stated, at Colombey-le-Bel. Thinking the chances good for a little private scrap of my own, I got my machine ready and left the aerodrome at 7:30. The 2 large flights were just fading away in the distance as I left the ground. By the time I reached Fleury I had attained an altitude of 15,000 feet, and was in a splendid position to witness the whole show. There were the English squadrons returning from this expedition against the supply depots of Conflans. They had evidently dropped all their bombs, and had quite as evidently aroused a hornet's nest in doing so. A large formation of enemy planes were following them hot-foot, and our fighting machines were climbing up to intercept them. Ahead of the British aeroplanes a furious storm of shrapnel indicated that Archie was not caught napping. The German shells burst below and ahead of the bombing squadron, but ceased as soon as the pursuing Hun machines approached that area. Those German batteries were putting up a beautiful performance, but they were lacking in just one essential. They couldn't hit the target. My own formations were at that moment passing over Thiaucourt, and were dashing forward with all speed to the rescue of the approaching Englishmen. It looked like a regular dogfight that was preparing before my very eyes. The Americans should reach the Englishmen at about the same time that the Huns overtook them from their rear. Suddenly I noticed something going wrong with the American formation below me. Evidently another enemy flight had come up from the west, and had started a free-for-all fight to prevent the Nieuport from giving aid to the bombers. As I watched this encounter I noticed one of our Nieuport, probably 3,000 feet below me and a little to the west, first flutter and then begin to fall out of control. Ever since the beginning of the stage setting I had been edging my way towards the center of the field where the opposing forces must meet. Now they were fairly under me. The stricken Nieuport had no sooner begun its uncontrollable spin than I noted 2 Albatross fighting machines set themselves on his tail. Instantly I descended pell-mell onto one of them, firing at long range and continuing my fire until, to my great relief, I saw my target falling steeply to earth, quite beyond control. The other albatross veered off and hastened away. I did not know who was the hapless pilot of the Nieuport, and could not tell in what condition he was. I started swiftly down beside him to ascertain whether he was beyond further help, or whether his whole performance was simply a ruse to get away from an overwhelming force. Before I had reached him, I saw the Nieuport come gracefully out of the spin, and with one long bank begin again its upward climb. It was only a ruse. The boy was coming back to the fight. Climbing above him, I turned again my attention to the thickest of the fray. The attacking Fokkers had been met by the remaining strength of the Americans by now, and the English bombers were nearing the Allied lines. A number of individual combats were waging in various parts of the heavens. I ran about from one to the other with a savage sort of elation urging me on. It is a glorious feeling to down an enemy in combat, and the sweetness of such a victory is more than doubled if it includes saving a comrade from a fall. Who this comrade was I did not know, but I saw that he was following me along as we searched the sky from place to place for a favorable opening. Finally it came. About 5 kilometers away in the direction of Pont-à-Mousson, I saw a running fight which had passed quite through the rest of the combatants. I had been flying in almost the opposite direction, and had not noticed their passing us. My recent protege had left me, and was already streaking it in their direction. I pulled over and started in pursuit, straining my eyes to distinguish what machines were involved in this new melee, to what sides they belonged, and how our fellows were faring. A glance at the lines told me that the British squadron was well away and unpursued. The little Nieuport ahead of me continued straight on, and while I was still half a mile away I saw him dart into the attack. There were 4 or 5 Nieuport against the same number of Albatross machines, and the whole show was drifting eastward towards the Moselle River. I slightly increased my altitude and prepared to select the most favorable door for my entrance. But whilst I was in the very act of entering it, a sudden change in the situation attracted my attention. The same little Nieuport that had been in trouble so recently over Thiaucourt, and which had again gone in red-headed against these albatross, was diving down on the tail of one enemy, while a second albatross, perceiving his advantage, had gotten into a similar position on his tail. Even while I was starting down to make the fourth in this headlong procession, I saw the leading albatross suddenly zoom sharply up and loop over onto his back. The Nieuport went under him at headlong pace. Both albatross were now on the Nieuport's tail, and I was firing intermittently at each of them, hoping to divert their attention for the fraction of a second necessary to relieve the pilot of the Nieuport. With a careful aim I settled a long burst of bullets into the albatross ahead of me. I saw at once that he was finished. The machine continued straight ahead until it crashed full into the forest that lines the east bank of the Moselle. In the midst of this diving battle the pilot in the Nieuport had tried the same maneuver that the enemy albatross had so recently achieved. Pulling back his joystick with great suddenness, the Nieuport rose and let the 2 machines, one a pursuer, the other my victim, and now pilotless, pass beneath him. But at the same instant came the sound of that sinister crackling that indicated to me the strain had again been too much for the strength of the Nieuport's wings. The whole surface of the canvas on the right wing was torn off with the first wrench. It was the same familiar old accident that had so nearly claimed Jimmy Meissner a fortnight previously, that had indeed landed Jimmy Hall a prisoner in German lines, and that had so terrified me a few days before. And here we were again, at least 4 miles north of No Man's Land. Would he disintegrate here, or would he be able to make some sort of landing in the forest-covered mountains below? It was a pitiable choice. Fortunately, we were left alone with our problem, the pilot of the other Nieuport and myself. The 2 albatross had evidently decided to call it a day and go in. They may never have known the catastrophe which overtook their coveted victim. The other enemy machines had carried on their attacks or retreats well beyond the Moselle. I took a rapid survey of the heavens before turning my helpless attention to the ugly situation in which my protege now found himself. Truly, if he gets out of this alive, I thought to myself, he will certainly survive the war. The boy who can pilot a machine without any fabric on it, as that chap is doing, is certainly something of an artist, I again said to myself as I put on the sauce and hastened to overtake my wobbly companion, who was staggering towards our lines much like a drunken man. But at any rate he was getting there. I came up to within 20 feet of him and looked curiously into the pilot's seat. There was Jimmy Meissner again, turning a cheery grin towards me and taking his ease while he waved a hand to me. Jimmy Meissner indeed. No wonder he could fly a machine without canvas. With the practice he was getting, he would soon be flying without wings. This was the second time he had gone through with practically the same experience, and I had saved him from attack on both occasions. I stayed close beside Jimmy all the way in. When he finally settled down on our field for his final little crash, he came wobbling over to me from the wreck, as blithe and merry as ever. "Thanks, old boy, for shooting down those Boche on my tail," said Jimmy, trying to be serious. "I'm beginning to like coming home without any wings on my machine." Just here Doug Campbell came out of the hangar and ran up to my machine. "Rick," said Douglas, "who was the poor fellow who ripped the canvas off his wings and fell just beyond Pont-a-Mousson? I saw the thing go down." "Doug," I returned seriously, "you simply can't kill some people." "But I've put in a report that he crashed," retorted Doug. "Taylor and I were in on that show that you just left. We beat you home. We both saw the wing come off that Nieuport when he came out of the dive. Who was he?" I pointed sadly at Jimmy without speaking. Then I pointed to the remains of his machine in the center of the field. "Jimmy Meissner," I said, climbing down from my machine. "I got 2 Huns through you today, and I thank you for them, but you really must stop this sort of thing. It's getting on my nerves." "Was it really you, Jimmy?" queried Campbell, coming up and hugging the unabashed Meissner. "And this is the second time you've gotten away with it." "You will never be shot down in air fighting, my son," contributed Thorne Taylor, who was also regarding our lucky pilot with unbelieving eyes. "Wait till Flatbush hears about this new stunt of yours." Jimmy Meissner comes from that part of Brooklyn known as Flatbush. While we were thus congratulating Jimmy upon his second miraculous escape on a collapsed machine, John Mitchell of 95 Squadron settled upon the field beside us. He had another interesting story of the day's adventure. He had noticed an enemy two-seater and 2 protecting fighting planes of the enemy accompanying it, just east of the British bombers who were returning. His entire formation dived down to the attack, and a brisk little battle took place at only 3,000 feet above ground. One after another Mitchell's formation of 6 machines peeked down at the two-seater and let go a burst. At the last swoop the enemy plane burst into flames and crashed. Then they took up the pursuit of the 2 defending planes, and Mitchell chased one of them as far north as Vigneulles, which is halfway to Metz from the front line trenches. At this point the fleeing Hun evidently decided that he was no match for the American who dared to follow him so deep within his own territory, for he dived suddenly to earth and attempted to land in a large open field just outside the town. Mitchell followed him all the way down, firing continuously as he attempted to land. The Boche pilot made a miscalculation of his distance, being probably scared out of his wits, ran full into a fence, and turned a double somersault before ending in a total smash. Just how the pilot came out of this misadventure Mitchell had no way of ascertaining, but as long as the wreckage remained in his sight no person attempted to emerge therefrom. It was a glorious day for 94 and 95 squadrons. We had brought down in combat 4 aeroplanes of the enemy without the loss of a single one of our own. We lost 1 machine through accident in this fight, but there were so many amusing incidents connected with this accident that none of us took it seriously. It happened in this way. The comedian in life of 95 Squadron was Lieutenant Casgrain of Detroit, Michigan. Lieutenant Mitchell took him along on this expedition, although it was his first trip over the lines. Casgrain kept in the formation and took a gallant part in the attack on the 2-seater machine which ended in its destruction in air. But in recovering from the downward dive, Casgrain made the same mistake which so many of us had made in pulling up the Nieuport too quickly. He lost his canvas, just as Meissner had done. Being unaware that the proper manipulation would permit him to fly home in that condition, Casgrain put his nose down immediately and began a long glide to earth. Evidently, he thought he was much nearer home than he was, for as we were told later by an artillery observer who had seen him land, Casgrain floated blandly halfway across No Man's Land, which is about a mile wide at this point, selected a smooth piece of ground and landed with the ease of an eagle. He stepped out of his machine with a nonchalant manner, map in hand, and set about quietly perusing it as much as to say, "Well, here I am. Now just where am I?" At this moment several rifle balls dug up the dirt at his heels. He dropped his map and made a jump for some nearby trees. After a short consideration of his position, he was seen to leave the trees and advance straight towards the German trenches, his hands held up in the air. Poor old Casgrain evidently thought he was well behind the German lines after his first rude awakening. As a matter of fact, he might just as well have walked in the other direction and passed through into our own lines if he had only known that he was in No Man's Land. The officers' mess at 95 Squadron do not tire of repeating this story to the present day. A few days after the cessation of hostilities, they learned from released prisoners with great satisfaction that their star comedian had been well cared for in the German prisons, where he had been the wit of the camp. A fortnight after his capture he was caught hoarding his food in order to have a supply on hand when an opportunity came for an escape. For this offense Casgrain was sent north to a distant camp in Prussia just before the armistice was signed. The American gunners who witnessed Casgraine's landing in No Man's Land brought their 75s to bear upon his aeroplane as soon as they discovered he had abandoned it. It lay somewhat nearer the German trenches than our own. All the rest of the day they hammered away at it without scoring a single hit. Presumably the novices in this battery were experimenting at range finding, for they shot away much ammunition without damaging the machine. This particular battery evidently had not had much practice before they left the United States. That night the humorous Boche in the trenches went out and secured the little plane. The next morning the American gunners saw the top plane of the Nieuport standing upright in the German front line trench. The bull's-eye cocarde, which was brightly painted with red and blue circles around a big white center, stood directly facing them as much as to say, "Now, here is the target. Take another try at it." From the frequency of these accidents to our Nieuport, it may be wondered why we continued to use them. The answer is simple. We had no others we could use. The American air forces were in dire need of machines of all kinds. We were thankful to get any kind that would fly. The French had already discarded the Nieuport for the steadier, stronger Spad, and thus our government was able to buy from the French a certain number of these out-of-date Nieuport machines for our American pilots, or go without. Consequently, our American pilots in France were compelled to venture out in Nieuport against far more experienced pilots in more modern machines. None of us in France could understand what prevented our great country from furnishing machines equal to the best in the world. Many a gallant life was lost to American aviation during those early months of 1918, the responsibility for which must lie heavily upon some guilty conscience.